Welcome to the 39th National Forum. This year, a three-part series, Health, Biodiversity, and Climate, A Path for a Livable Future. I'm Jay Feldman, Executive Director of Beyond Pesticides. The forum is based on two science-based premises. One, understanding of the problem is key to motivating action, and two, solutions are available. The clarity and urgency of our discussion and strategy have come into exquisite focus on first, a frightening range of pesticide-induced health threats, second, biodiversity collapse, and third, the climate emergency. All these crises, which intersect with fossil fuel-based pesticides and fertilizers, are upon us. To turn things around requires us to be holistic in our thinking and put an end to petrochemical pesticides and fertilizers. With a 41-year history, Beyond Pesticides and our allies are working to end the use of toxic pesticides and fertilizers, not one by one, but by changing our relationship with the land and the ecosystem to embrace nature, ecosystem services, and the delicate balance that sustains life. Regulatory attempts to mitigate individual chemical risks have failed, so we're precautionary. We began working to transition to organic practices in the early 1980s and codified the principles and values of organic in the 1990 Organic Foods Production Act. And now we are transitioning communities and land management to organic practices alongside a $60 billion organic food market, still a fraction of what is needed. At the same time, we fiercely protect the integrity of organic standards. This forum launches a 10-year strategic vision to end the use of toxic pesticides and fertilizers by transitioning parks, playing fields, schoolyards, backyards, open space, and rights of way to organic, and growing demand for organic food. With this strategy, we can feed the world, maintain our quality of life, enhance biodiversity, protect health, and create resiliency. We are guided by Rachel Carson and her book, Silent Spring, which this year celebrates its 60th anniversary. Her words of warning against pesticides resonate, and her embracing of alternatives was a roadmap in 1962 as it is today. The chemical industry and lobby continue to fight us, but at the same time, the business community is seeing the opportunities in organic transition. Our forum is an instrument for empowering change and adds to our daily community-based organic land management work, science tracking, and policy advocacy, changing our local, state, and national culture, law, and practices to embrace an organic future. The presentations today will be followed by a Q&A, which will be extended at the end of the presentations by up to 30 minutes at the end of this session. And so use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen for questions. I'm now honored to introduce Jane Little, who will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Claudia Miller. Jane is a longtime journalist with the BBC, Public Radio, and Current Affairs Broadcasting. So I turn it over to you, Jane. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jay, for inviting me to be part of this event on a subject very close to my heart. Jay and I first connected in March, thanks to Claudia Miller, after I got hit hard by herbicides in my neighborhood in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I had been looking for advice on how to change the way my homeowners association managed the communal areas. Specifically, I wanted to get rid of a lawn care company that says its products are safe for kids and dogs. I beg to differ. I had walked my dog Ronan along a strip that I later discovered had been sprayed earlier with two concoctions, many different chemicals in it, and they included 2,4-D, which many know was a main ingredient in Agent Orange. And I was quickly hit by burning and numbness and headaches and dizziness, lots of neurological symptoms and more over the ensuing days. Sometimes I would have to sit down abruptly because I couldn't feel my legs, they were so weak. Now, most people would not connect such a weird array of ailments with unseen chemicals, but I recognized them as pesticide induced because I'd been having reactions to supposedly benign low-dose chemicals for 2 decades, since a trip I made home to the English Lake District in 2001. Then the outbreak of foot and mouth disease was threatening the animals and livelihoods of farmers, including my dad. The government mandated the use of dozens of different disinfectants, pesticides, to try to prevent spread of the disease. I was home for only a week and I had to dip my feet in a noxious brew at the gateway to my parents' farm every time I came and went. My new boots dropped to pieces within a week. My dad and I both had severe reactions. We developed multi-system problems and I went from one specialist to the next. Both of us were briefly hospitalized. His cardiologist sent a warning, a yellow card report to the relevant government ministry, which is as close as many know as a doctor would get to saying this man's heart tachycardia is likely linked to these pesticides. I had the same heart problem. Dad knew farmers sickened with mystery heart viruses. So meanwhile, I was on a quest to prove the government was using a sledgehammer to crack a nut and taking many of us out in the process. I focused my hopes on a well-known toxicologist. He told me that it would be impossible to prove that A caused B, therefore there was no connection. And he offered me antidepressants. I didn't take them, but I was all but bedbound for months. Dad and I recovered. I ended up in Arizona and got well, and I eventually returned to work after 18 months. But both of us started to react to unrelated toxicants. Nail polish, bleach, paint, all sorts of things became hazardous. I could get sick after a brief whiff of something and be off work for days or longer. I could name many examples. But the last time I worked as a BBC correspondent was in Washington several years ago. The fire alarm went off and I had to flee a studio at 11 o'clock at night and hurry down 8 flights of stairs. I knew it wasn't a fire because I could smell the solvents. I got outside just in time to hear the fire chief telling cleaners to go easy on this stuff. They'd been using acetone to polish the elevators. I went into a long health crisis. So it all sounds a bit grim so far, right, doesn't it? And I will admit there have been moments of regret, including over the last week when I've had to watch from afar as friends, former colleagues covered the events after the Queen's death, and I had to sit out this huge news event. My first big story was the death of Princess Diana. But, and here's the upside, I have been led on a different path. It's a path on which I've learned a lot about health and the environment and their connectedness. I've learned that being a canary in the mine can be a blessing as well as a curse. And I have met some inspiring people along the way, including Claudia Miller. In 2015, I made a radio documentary called Allergic to the 21st Century. And it featured people who were far sicker than I, who'd had to remove themselves from modern life and build their own very basic homes in rural Arizona. And in my effort to find out why, I came across Professor Miller's work and interviewed her. Her work struck me as deeply intuitively true, not least because she'd faced so much resistance for so long from entrenched interests. She's an allergist by background who spent decades trying to break down the silos in medicine and has come up with a new theory of disease called toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, or TILT, to explain the experiences of a sizable minority of us across the world. It's a famous axiom that science progresses one funeral at a time and that it takes years to see a paradigm shift. But a paradigm shift is exactly what Claudia Miller is driving here. And it feels to me like we're in that moment, that many doctors are now linking illnesses to environmental toxins, and there's a growing awareness that something has to change. We poison the earth, we poison ourselves, but there's still time to make a change. My HOA went organic, by the way. Claudia's work is a key to understanding what is happening and what we can do for our own health. It's my great honor to introduce Professor, Doctor, Pioneer, and friend, Claudia Miller.
Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate that very warm introduction. And Jane as a journalist, introduced me to one of the experts on mast cells. And you can see by the title, this is going to be talking about pesticides, toxic and induced loss of tolerance, and mast cells, which now we recognized as a principle. 1 second, I see I'm being asked to put my video on. As a principle mechanism for what happens when people do get exposed to various things like pesticides, but other things too. For example, people who've gotten sick while they were in the World Trade Center after that event, or after getting sick after an exposure to volatile organic chemicals in a house that was poorly ventilated. So there are many different exposures, and what's surprising is how many of these lead to the same kind of mechanisms. And that, I'm going to be talking about that mechanism, which is something I hope you can convey to people you know, and will make it understandable to physicians and others what's going on. Thank you, Jane, and thanks to Jay for his years of advocacy. I think he said 40 years, I think 45 years ago is when I started in this area. And 1977 was supposed to be a very good year. I'm going to ask to put up my first slide if they would. So my husband and I had moved to a suburban area where there's big enough lots, it's like 1.5 acres, where we could have a vegetable garden. I grew flowers. Bob, who's a Vietnam veteran who did not get sick from Agent Orange, but is very sensitive to these issues, he grew a beautiful vegetable garden. Next slide. So and there were sunflowers next. And here's the vegetable garden, which was, we ate from, and it was organic. Next slide. And this is the house that we moved into. And it was an older house on a nice acreage, but quite an old house. And what we did is we got married at that time. It was a wonderful year, 1977. We adopted a 2-month-old Burmese kitten. And then the exterminator came. There were bugs in the house, and I did not like bugs. I grew up in Wisconsin. And what the problems was, there were wasps and spiders, and I just didn't care for bugs. And I actually invited, this is my big mistake in life, I invited an exterminator to come in and spray the eaves and inside the house. Soon after that, our 2-month-old kitten died, got droopier and droopier, and finally died. And only many years later did I learn that cats, and certainly kittens, are especially sensitive to organophosphate pesticides, which many of you are very familiar with. In 2000, the year 2000, again, this is decades later, Environmental Protection Agency banned the use of these particular pesticides, which had made me sick and killed our kitten, for any use indoors. But their use continues, as Jay Feldman knows and Jane Little knows too well, that these things are still being used, and that farmers and farm workers and their families are being exposed and are sick from pesticides. This experience drove me to medical school. It led me to, of course, avoid using any pesticides. I became very sensitive to many different things, which I'll talk about in a moment. And this became the impetus for my research for the past 45 years. It's hard to believe I've known Jay almost that entire time. So I'd like to begin by asking you to ask yourselves 3 key questions, which we use now. These are research questions we use to survey and determine whether certain individuals may become or may have become more sensitive to everyday exposures, which are derived from fossil fuels. I'm going to emphasize fossil fuels. Next slide. So ask yourself right now, does this apply to you? Do you feel sick when you are exposed to tobacco smoke, certain fragrances, nail polish or remover, engine exhaust, gasoline, air fresheners, pesticides, paint thinner, fresh tar or asphalt, cleaning supplies, new carpet or furnishings. By sick, we mean you experience headaches, difficulty thinking, difficulty breathing, weakness, dizziness, upset stomach, or something like that. Yes or no. Number 2, next slide. Regarding foods, are you unable to tolerate or do you have adverse reactions to any foods such as dairy products, wheat, corn, eggs, caffeine, alcoholic beverages, or food additives such as MSG or food dyes? Number 3, are you unable to tolerate or do you have adverse or allergic-like reactions to any drugs or medications such as antibiotics, anesthetics, pain relievers, X-ray contrast dye, vaccines, or birth control pills, or to an implant, prosthesis, contraceptive chemical or device, or other medical, surgical, dental material, or procedures? So yes or no? Okay, so those are the 3 questions. I'm going to show you in our surveys of 10,000 Americans, adults, how they responded to these questions. Next slide. And by the way, these are starting to be used across the world. So in our study of 10,000 US adults, those who answered yes to any of those 3 questions, any one of them, this is the distribution of their responses. 1 in 5, in other words, 20% reported intolerances to all 3 chemicals, foods, and drugs. And you can see the overlap in the center of the Venn diagram between chemicals, drugs, and foods. Those are the most sensitive and now susceptible individuals. And also note that over half of the people, that green ellipse, half of those people that we surveyed who said they had become ill reported food intolerances. And so this taught us that we need to pay attention to the gut microbiome. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Of course, organophosphate pesticides affect the bacteria in our GI tract. And so an organophosphate pesticide and antibiotics actually have much the same effect on the microbiome in the GI tract. Next. So what is toxicant-induced loss of tolerance? So people who answered all 3 of those questions, yes, or even one of them might have had this kind of experience. Initiation of their symptoms and illness by an acute exposure or repeated lower level exposures. So acute exposure like pesticides that Jane just described, or repeated lower level exposures, for example, in a sick building. Triggering by previously tolerated chemicals or foods is the 2nd stage. And so if you look at number 1 on that iceberg drawing, that's the beginning of the process. Number 2 is triggering, and that is being triggered by having adverse reactions to things, chemicals, foods, drugs that never bothered the person before and do not bother most people. And then the waterline where it says masking, that is what hides the relationship between exposures and symptoms. And there's actually a question about what your ongoing exposures are. For example, if you smoke, you're not going to recognize that certain things like fragrances or exposures to even pesticides bother you. But that's actually a phenomenon we call masking. And you'll see how we assess masking. The more masked a person is, the less able they are to recognize symptom triggers. And look on the left-hand side of that diagram. You see the physician there in their Titanic. This was actually done before the movie Titanic. But he or she sees the symptoms that you report to the doctor, and they make a diagnosis, which is simply a label to summarize those symptoms, whether they say it's chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, migraine headaches, or something else. It's a diagnosis, but it does not tell you what's beneath the waterline, what initiated this process. They may recognize some triggers, but they can't tell you what started this whole process. And so this has been the focus of our research over the last 40 years or so. Next slide. So what are some of the things that can initiate tilt, the stage 1, and or trigger responses, adverse responses? These include, and I'll start at 12 o'clock, many different solvents, drugs and medical devices, pesticides, and you see the whole list there, things that you've heard the names of before. Oil and petrochemical or petroleum products, oil spills, people living near fracking operations, cleaning agents, phenolic disinfectants, those that end in OL, the name ends in OL, ammonia, bleach. And of course, these are things that we were encouraged to use post-COVID or during COVID. And many people who were sensitive had trouble with trying to clean their homes or being near someone or an apartment where others were cleaning with these chemicals. Combustion related products, and there you see a whole host of things from engine exhaust, well fire, exposures to tobacco smoke. These are combustion products, very fine, get into the air and they linger there for hours. Burn pits are a relatively new group, and then fires in a building. And then at 11 o'clock, I guess that is, indoor air volatile organic compounds. For example, the new carpet that was installed in the EPA building when it was remodeled, many people became chemically intolerant. Plasticizers of various kinds, formaldehyde, fragrances, and that's a big item. And the reason it's a big item is that once people become ill with this mechanism, toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, the most difficult exposure and most ubiquitous exposure they face are fragrances these days, which are almost impossible to avoid in any public building, even medical settings. And then mold VOCs, and this is relatively new in terms of our understanding that the toxicants released by molds, the smell of mold, for certain molds can affect mast cells too in a way that we'll describe. Next slide. Now, most of us spend most of our day, at least in industrialized countries, indoors, where the VOC exposures, volatile organic chemicals, are 5 to 10 times higher than outside. And so the first drawing at the top shows you a gas chromatograph sample in a building where you had a sick building or sick home, many VOCs present. And that's not unusual. If you look outdoors, the same building at the same time, you see many fewer VOCs, and yet the attention that EPA and many other agencies have paid to communities has been mostly focused on outdoor exposures they can easily measure rather than indoors where we spend most of our day. Both are important, but you may be far away from a place that's releasing pesticides or from a plant that's releasing some kinds of chemicals into the air. And once people become sensitive from tilt, let's say the pesticide exposure, these kinds of indoor air exposures trigger their symptoms. So tilt involves sensitization of mast cells, a biomechanism has been overlooked by toxicologists and allergists. Why is that? Because these are such low-level exposures that can trigger people's responses. And this is a response that involves the immune system and sensitization of mast cells, much like an allergy, but this is not an allergy. It doesn't involve immunoglobulins like IgE. And so this whole idea of this biomechanism has been just missed entirely by physicians who are guided by writing in toxicology and in allergy immunology. So it's in terms of the toxicologists, they test chemicals by giving a dose to usually rats or mice, and then finding a dose where there's no observable adverse effect level. And once they find that, then they apply a safety factor. And then that becomes the standard for all federal agencies. This is the National Toxicology Program on Environmental of Scientific Board of Scientific Counselors, on which I served for about 4 years. And they do not recognize, they have not dealt with tilt. This is going to be new for them to be able to understand that tilt is something between toxicology and allergy, that people who may lack certain detoxification enzymes may be more prone to developing an intolerance for or getting sick from an organophosphate pesticide. However, the level that triggers their symptoms is far lower than what a toxicologist would recognize. And unfortunately, those standards built by toxicologists are what get into courtrooms and federal agencies. The allergists have overlooked this because this doesn't involve IgE or other immunoglobulins. And their specialty had not until recently, I hope this changes, involved looking at the mast cell itself, which is sensitizable. Next slide. So in this survey that we did of 10,000 adults in the United States, we found that those who were chemically intolerant, using the questionnaire that we validated, and I'll show that to you in a moment, that nearly half of them reported one or more events that initiated their illness. And this is really informative to us. We had not expected mold to come up, but it does. And the molds produce volatile organic chemicals that themselves are toxic to mast cells. And if a person is so unlucky to have had mold in their house and subsequently treat it with fungicides or mildewicides, then they have kind of a double exposure, not only to the mold, but also to the pesticides or fungicides. Remodeling and new construction, like the EPA building I described, about 13% of those who were sick, and fifth Queasy criteria reported that had initiated their illness. Medical procedure or medical drugs like chemotherapy, 13.2%. Pesticides were 12% of this population. And actually before the banning of OPs, organophosphates indoors, it was a higher percentage than this. And then combustion products, about 7%. And this is interesting because breast implant patients whom we have surveyed, they constituted 3% roughly of the general population in the United States who had become ill from having implants. And let me just say, it's one of the key things here is to get rid of the initiating event. If people don't do that, if they don't stop exterminating their houses with pesticides, if they don't get rid of the breast implants, stop being exposed to combustion products, for example, to a gas stove, believe it or not, get rid of the mold in the house, hopefully safely. If they don't do those things, they don't get well. So this is what we've learned about initiating exposures. They can reduce all kinds of things, get all kinds of medical treatments, but they cannot recover unless they stop being exposed to these initiating chemical exposures. I'm just going to continue and say most of these things are byproducts of fossil fuels. This is what we have recognized. The exception is mold, and yet the volatile organic chemicals from mold act very much like the volatile organic chemicals which come off of various construction or remodeling projects. So that has been another awakening that we've had in the last year or two. Next. And what kinds of diagnoses do patients get when they see their doctors after these kinds of events, after they're exposed to a pesticide? Well, Jane gave a good summary of some of the things that happened to her, but often these patients are discounted because they have symptoms and all of these different symptoms and all of these different symptoms. And to a doctor, it's like, you've got too many symptoms and too many organ systems. I can't make any sense of this. And that is true. It is very hard. And they give them diagnoses based upon their presentation, a label. And it may be chronic fatigue syndrome, maybe migraine headaches, it may be asthma, or combinations of these different things. So remember that these are simply labels. They don't tell you the etiology, the underlying cause for people develop so many of these problems. By the way, about 1/4 of the patients that primary care physicians see have what we call medically unexplained symptoms, or MUS, medically unexplained symptoms. So 25% of people who, family practice doctors, people out in the community, they'll see people with these multi-system symptoms. They won't know to ask the right questions to determine what might have initiated their problems. Was it a pesticide? Was it remodeling? And we have developed a questionnaire to kind of help people through that process, guide not just the patients, but help them guide their doctors through that process. Next slide. So here's a paper that we produced, and this was actually the very beginning of my work in this area. And we were looking at people who became chemically sensitive after pesticide exposure and comparing it to people who became sick after remodeling of their home or a building. So next slide. And here's a graph from that paper. You can see that these individuals develop many different intolerances, which you'll hear more about, but it ranges from even things like, well, common exposures. Pesticides certainly are in there, fragrances. People recognize these exposures trigger their symptoms, even though their illness began after either a pesticide exposure or VOCs in remodeling of a building. It didn't seem to matter. They ended up with the same kinds of intolerances. Next slide. Likewise, this really surprises that both of those exposure groups, the pesticide and the remodeling group, reported the same food triggers, many foods that bothered them, in nearly the same order. Now, all of these slides will be available to you as well as the papers are available. But just notice that things that people love to eat, like chocolate or drinking wine or beer, those things became a problem for these individuals, things that never bothered them before. I had Gulf War veterans I interviewed, and I did see about 60 of them for the VA, who said that, they'd enjoy drinking maybe a case of beer on a weekend or something. Well, now they cannot tolerate one beer. Likewise, people women particularly, who used to like red wine, right? They can't drink red wine. They can drink white wine, maybe, which has fewer congeners, those tannins that come from the skins of the grapes in them. But these things changed after their exposures to pesticides or VOCs in remodeling. Next. Or after the Gulf War. So when I was in Chicago, it happened that Theron Randolph, who was a board certified allergist, he's passed away, and studied adverse food reactions. He started seeing patients that were saying, well, I've got these chemical intolerances too. And they would talk about being in the train station or having different kinds of plastics and so on in their environment that would bother them. He wrote 4 books and actually more than 300 medical articles. And he designed the world's first, and this is actually the gold standard, first environmentally controlled hospital units. Next slide. And here I am with him at a meeting. My co-author at MIT and I received an award, and he was there at that time, and he loved our book. Next slide. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but this is a kind of environmental medical unit that he set up. And everything in there is non-outgassing. It doesn't release chemicals. And when patients are at home and they're very sensitive, if you look at the bottom part of that slide, you can see that their reactions to chemicals, foods, and drugs may overlap in time. And unless you stop those exposures, they do not get well. And they go through a period of withdrawal for the first few days. And subsequently, during this time, they drink pure spring water, breathe filtered air, and they fast. Once they're at a clean baseline, then they can be tested with organic, and I emphasize organic foods, 1 per meal. And literally, people can tell the difference when they would have an organic apple from their grandmother's orchard compared to eating a commercial apple that was waxed and pesticide many, many times. So that's an important test that people can do to determine whether they are bothered by foods that are not organic. Once they're on a tolerated diet, then the patients were challenged with everyday low-level chemical exposures. And that might be simple things like carbonless copy paper, which was a big thing back then. Next slide. This is our book, which I'm not going to talk about or advocate, just to let you know it's been very positively reviewed by many excellent journals and publications. And it's available to you online at no charge. And that's our website, which you'll have access to. And that's for patients, physicians, or anyone. Our publisher was very kind about letting us put it online. Next slide. By the way, there's a whole section on pesticides in there, as well as one on Gulf War veterans and people who become chemically intolerant from many different exposures. So this is a paper that actually it was the second paper after the organophosphate and remodeling paper that I wrote with Tom Prabhoda, who's a statistician. Statisticians are vital in this. And we can control the symptoms and intolerances reported by people in those groups that you see, Gulf War veterans, implant recipients, and so on, and found that they all had very similar kinds of symptoms, intolerances, and that told us that we were dealing with a general disease mechanism, because these are very different initiating exposures. So something was going on that made these groups appear very similar and have multi-system symptoms and multiple intolerances for chemicals, foods, and drugs that never bothered them before. Next slide. And this is a questionnaire which you will have access to, that we developed, and is now the internationally validated reference standard for diagnosing chemical intolerance and toxicant-induced loss of tolerance. It's been translated and used by researchers in more than 16 countries, with more than 80 studies published in peer-reviewed journals, and it's free online, again, at our website. And you may use that yourselves or offer it to anyone you know. And I believe Jay sent this to you in kind of an advanced message, something that you could do and watch a video on how this works and how you can use it. Next slide. So this questionnaire was developed by asking questions of people who got sick after these different exposures and what things triggered them, like I just said. And you can see those on the left, common exposures. And we had people score the severity of their symptoms from 0 to 10, and there were 10 items on the scale. There's also some additional scales. Next. This is another important scale. We have people rate the severity of their symptoms. For example, problems with their heart racing, or problems with breathing, or problems with thinking, brain fog, difficulties, changes in their mood that are hard to explain, like sudden rage or crying. Think of road rage. I mean, that kind of response. Problems with balance, coordination, headaches, and so on, skin problems. So I'm not going to go through this whole thing because it's available to you, but these 10 items actually can be graphed very neatly. So you can show how people were prior to their exposure in terms of their symptoms and after their exposure. Next slide. So this is an example of someone who was exposed to mold, but it could be pesticides. And each one of those 10 items that I was referring to for symptoms is graphed on that, we call it a target diagram or a symptom star. And at 12 o'clock, there are symptoms related to the head, cognitive difficulties, affective or mood symptoms, neuromuscular, musculoskeletal, skin at 6 o'clock, genitourinary, GI, heart-related symptoms, and airway mucous membrane. So those 10 symptom items that are rated 0 to 10 on the Queasy can be graphed like this. This is going to help you a lot if you have someone who had an exposure of any kind, whether it's a pesticide or something else. They can graph their symptoms. The red line represents symptoms of one of the individuals that we've worked with. The green is how they say they were prior to their exposure to pesticides or to mold. So you can see the huge increase in the levels of their symptoms. The circle in the outer rim is 10 and 0 is in the center. So rating the severity of their symptoms on those 10 scales gives you a picture, a graph of how severely affected they were by their exposure. The diagram, the symptom star to the right, the red is the same. It's like how they are now. The blue is following an intervention, for example, getting rid of the mold, moving to a non-moldy house, stopping the use of pesticides and getting away from any pesticides, getting breast implants out. That's what you can show with this symptom star. Working with a group now that's dealing with the spill in the Gulf War. I'm sorry, in the Gulf, where people became ill after the BP oil disaster, and they are looking at graphing pre and post exposure symptoms. Even if exposure was long ago, you can do this, and it's very helpful for showing this to a family, to friends, to relatives, to actually other physicians. And we recommend people take the Queasy and this information, fill it out themselves, which is available online, and take it to their doctors and ask that it be placed in their medical records to illustrate how much worse they are now since their exposure. Next. So, and then there's another thing. This is a sort of the third element of our self-assessment. Asking, did people become sick after a particular exposure event? What was exposure? When did it occur? Things you would expect. This is an interesting one though. Were any other people or animals exposed? If so, who and what symptoms did they experience? So this is actually a picture of a Burmese kitten. It isn't the one we have, but it's to remind me to tell you, this is one of the ways we knew that we had had a problem in the house. Not only did I feel sick, but our kitten, who was susceptible to organophosphate pesticides, also got real droopy after several days and finally died. Next slide. So organic chemical production, these fossil fuels are used to produce synthetic organic chemicals. And since World War II, our exposures to these have increased exponentially. And this includes exposures to pesticides, obviously, so-called persistent organic pollutants, endocrine disruptors, and fragrances. These are all synthetic organic chemicals. We did not have synthetic organic chemicals until chemists invented them around World War II. And look at how the various kinds of exposures, production and exposures have increased since the very beginning in World War II, 1945. Next. Further, and it's hard to get this data, but this is a graph of pesticide production since World War II. And you can see that there's been a rapid increase in pesticide production, and much of it has changed to other forms that are not so easily monitored. And this is not posted anymore by EPA. So this is actually a pretty unique slide because people are using many different things. So different kinds of fungicides and different pesticides like glyphosate, actually, which was introduced. You can see when it was introduced around 73 or so, 74. Now, Randolph, the physician who first identified this chemical susceptibility problem, he started diagnosing patients in 1950, which was just after World War II. Up until that time, people had usual allergies and problems with foods, but it was then that he saw people who were getting sick from many common exposures, including pesticides. Next. Now, this is important. I'm going to ask you to take your right hand and put it on top of your left hand. Okay. And look at that. Your two hands are identical, except they're different in terms of how they're configured. And that's what this diagram is showing. When you produce synthetic organic chemicals, you can end up with what we call mirror images of 2 or 3 or even more different chemicals. And so if you hold your hand up, you can see that it's a mirror image. You can see it in the mirror. And if you have a glove that fits on your right hand, it won't fit on your left hand. The same thing with chemicals that have several different, we call these enantiomers, but they have mirror image molecules. And they don't work well in certain kinds of biological systems. And we're talking now about every synthetic chemical produced since World War II. And examples include the thalidomide, which resulted in terrible birth defects in children decades ago. Some of you may remember that. Synthetic fragrances, these result in mirror image molecules. Natural fragrances do not do this. Pesticides, the same thing. There's some natural forms of pesticides that I know you all are familiar with. Not true for the synthetic pesticides they affect receptors differently. And this is something I like to say to people who aren't familiar with mast cells, but it kind of act like the bouncers in a nightclub. So if they see some chemical or foreign substance, even a virus coming in, and it's a big insult to them because they're the ones that protect us from external exposures, they will actually kick them out. They will remove them just like a bouncer in a nightclub would do to a customer who was insulting them. If they only insult them just, now and then repetitively, then it'll take them longer, but the mast cell sensitize and they will eventually kick that customer out. So that's kind of how they protect our tissues and all of our tissues. Next slide. And I'm not going to spend time on this drawing, but I want you to look on the right side. When the Arab oil embargo occurred in 1973 to 1974, some of you probably don't even remember this, the need to conserve energy led to reduced requirements for fresh air in commercial buildings, schools, offices, and so on. And it went from 30 down to 5 cubic feet per minute per person of fresh air required in the building. And the result was a whole generation of sick buildings, many of which are still with us, and people are using things in those buildings and they're getting sick from using them, whether it's pesticides, bleach, disinfectants, or something else. Notice though, there were no, and there still are no requirements for fresh air to dilute pollutants that are inside your home. Again, whether it's pesticides that were applied, mold, cleaning agents, fragrances, those things accumulate to a much higher level because there are no requirements to dilute the pollutants inside your home. In fact, people put on more insulation in order to save money, and that's promoted by various companies that help with provide insulation and counsel families. Next slide.
4 minutes, Claudia, 4 minutes.
Okay. So talk a little bit about other things that have changed since World War II, but actually even more recently. And this is since the introduction, I'm not going to say it's particular chemical, but children that were born in 1992. Again, this is data from CDC. You'll see a lot of graphs of how autism has gone up exponentially. But CDC's data says that autism affected 1 in 150 children that were born in 1992. But in 2010, 1 in 44 children were affected. So you can see the huge rise in autism, which is absolutely a devastating problem for people and their families. Next. And by the way, autism really didn't exist to any great extent prior to World War II. The first cases came in after World War II. Maternal chemical and drug intolerances. So if a mother tests positive on the queasy, they're 3 times as likely to have a child with autism and 2.3 times as likely to have a child with ADHD as compared to control mothers who do not test positive on the queasy. Now that was startling, but this is a way almost of predicting who may develop autism. And we have measures that we recommend, for example, avoiding pesticide use in this paper to help people reduce their exposures when the child's in utero or when it's new. Next. And this is a paper about mast cells and how they explain many of these cases that we're talking about. And this just came out in December of last year. And in that period of time, it's had, I think, more than 12,000 views by people. It's published, notice this, by Environmental Sciences Europe, which is a journal that goes through regulatory toxicologists worldwide. And regulatory toxicologists want to understand what's going on. They're seeing this problem too. And they're not biased by any kind of corporate or other influences. So mast cells, which were described more than 100 years ago, there is a plausible biomechanism now for tilt occurring following toxicant sensitization of mast cells, which are our immune system's first responders to all foreign chemicals, including synthetic organic chemicals, foods and food additives, medications, and recreational drugs. Next. And this is a picture of a mast cell under electron microscopy on the left. And you can see those little black storage granules, which are released when the mast cell is encountered. It's been sensitized and re-encounters a customer, if you will, or a chemical that it's been sensitized to. And on the right, you see a drawing kind of showing how there's a whole cell, mast cell, and will release all these substances. They start out, they're white cells that start out in the bone marrow, and they migrate to the interface between all of our tissues and the external environment where they protect us. And we're talking about our airways, lungs, obviously, digestive tract, skin, urogenital tract, lymphatic, and blood vessels. They are also present at the blood-brain barrier, on the brain side of the blood-brain barrier. When they're triggered, they release histamine and many inflammatory mediators, cascades of up to 1,000 mediators. And they not only release the existing mediators they've formed, but they make more at the same time that they're releasing these new ones.
60 seconds, Claudia.
Okay, next. Should be just about right. So this is a video of a mast cell degranulating. And it's about 30 seconds. Can you run it? Great. And all of those granules, which contain thousands of chemicals, travel throughout the system, not only locally, but then they will affect other systems. So that's how things that happen in the gastrointestinal tract, where we have the largest number of mast cells to deal with the biggest amount of foreign substances we deal with, that is our food, that affects other organ systems. And that you probably have heard about the connection between the brain and the GI tract. Next slide. Almost finished here. So just let me say, think about this. 500 million years ago, mast cells first evolved in vertebrate fish, 500 million years ago. 250 million years ago, the first mammals, and that's the olfactory and limbic system, which actually regulates our attention and mood and memory. And that's critical, and that's what makes mammals and humans what they are and how they can respond appropriately to their young. 300 years ago, early man evolved. 3,500 years ago, Bible first described mold illnesses. 300 years ago was the Industrial Revolution. Remember, fossil fuel chemicals started then. Exposures to coal, natural gas, oil, their combustion products. Only 150 years ago, Freud diagnosed hysteria. And frequently these were wealthy women, patrons who lived in homes where coal gas or gas lighting was new in those homes. There was no awareness that exposures could be causing these problems. Less than 100 years ago, as we've said, synthetic organic chemical production began and grew exponentially. And that includes all of the things there, including psychiatric medications. Next slide.
Need to wrap up.
Okay, and finally, this is going through some of the things that we've talked about, that it's only starting since 1950. There, Randolph described the petrochemical problem. The oil embargo occurred. We proposed toxicant-induced loss of tolerance as a new stage theory of disease based upon what patients told us in Europe and the United States. There was no biomechanism known. But now, just last year, we published a two-stage biomechanism for tilt. And this has received a great deal of attention, and I'm delighted to be able to talk with you about this and how you can use it in your own work. We may have a slide or two more. Oh, so this is the last point. So ironically, we're humans. We can tell when we're having brain fog. We can tell people we're having problems tolerating certain foods. We're having digestive problems, fatigue, irritability. We can talk about autism, hyperactivity. These subjective, medically unexplained symptoms and conditions, but are we now serving as the role models, animal role models for other species on our planet, which cannot articulate these problems? And I think the answer is yes, given that, I know it's yes, no, given how long ago mast cells evolved, 500 million years ago is a long time. Thank you. I think I finished all my slides, just under time.
Yes, thank you so much, Claudia. I mean, wow. I think this sets a framework for how we should be discussing the exposures that are going on in a more holistic way, cell function, organ systems. And we're not doing this, right? As regulators, as legal, as policy and legal standards are not taking this approach. So our goal is to use this information with people that are making decisions on chemical use so that they can be more informed about the alternatives. So thank you so much for your lifelong work on this and your continued vigilance and continued publications. Keep at it, please. We need you. We need you doing this stuff.
Thank you.
So I will now segue to the next speaker, who really is intended to have a conversation about how we do make the transition away from chemical dependency. And the person who will be introducing this, our next speaker, who is Kaipo Kekona, is a staff member Beyond Pesticides, but is an institution to herself in Hawaii and has worked tirelessly to affect the transition. So she's the director of Hawaii Organic Land Management for Beyond Pesticides. And it is Autumn Ness. Thank you, Autumn.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Miller. Listening to that and to a lot of the science around the effects of these chemicals in our bodies does get a little heavy. So the good news is that we really already know the alternative to chemical intensive land management. We just have to really collectively remember what we know and revive the practices that we already know work. I find myself often reminding people in my work in Hawaii that the word culture is the basis of the word agriculture for a reason. We are in hearings and community meetings and day after day here about the problems of pesticides in our environment. And the question is always, well, what do we do about it then? Like, how do we manage our farmlands and our landscapes without these things then? And I always go back to that. There's to the word culture in agriculture. It's by design that over the years we've been separated from that knowledge. It's by design that centuries old indigenous knowledge about how to care for and live in balance with land and farms has been replaced with university agriculture, university weed science, university agronomy departments that are funded by chemical corporations. As a society over the years, corporate influence has completely removed the culture from agriculture and replaced it with products, profit, chemicals. Years of corporate control of farmland and land management systems has successfully turned what used to be one of our most fundamental relationships with the earth into a contributor to multiple environmental and health crises. But again, there's good news because there are folks like Kaipo who are really returning to that old knowledge and showing that we can use old skills and old knowledge in new ways to revolutionize how we care for land in ways that not only don't make us sick, but also make us and our environment healthier. So I'm going to turn this over to Kaipo. You ready? Okay.
All right. Aloha mai kako. My name is Kaipo Kekona. I live on the island of Maui, on the west end, known as a town called Lahaina. I run an educational farm site in Lahaina. KAEC is our site name. It stands for Ku'ia Agriculture Education Center. We reach out into the community. We do workshops with our children. We do a lot of educational programs, just introducing the methodologies of farming that we use. And today I'm gonna share some of that. In front of you, you see the title called Kamalu Uluolele. That is a name of an old food forest system that we had in Lahaina, dating as far back as the 1200 AD, if you will. And Kamalu Uluolele was an old food forest system that was about 10.5 acres in size. What we are working to do on our site is to bring back a fraction of that. So here is an artisan's rendition of the early 1700s of what our town used to look like in Lahaina. We had inland ponds where we raised fish, and we would harvest fish from those ponds as well as replenish the ocean's stock as well when the ponds would reach their capacity. So this is kind of an idea of where we came from. For me, farming in a place where I am, I needed to understand what the history held in order to try and produce what was known to provide here. So these are tools that I use to help me familiarize myself with those areas. The old name of Lahaina generally translates to the merciless sun. And the old name of Lahaina was Leleolena. So at one point, the area was not known to be under the drought conditions and the sun exposure that we have today. It was known to be very canopied over, a lot of forest growth, and food was very abundant in this area. Not only food, but everything that we needed to exist as a society: clothing, medicinal crops, implement, hardwoods, all of that amongst the food was found within that system. And that's kind of where we want to get to in the end of our project. There is a number of proverbs that we have in Hawaii that we hold to as part of our traditions. It can lead you from many of our family values, as far as how to conduct oneself respectfully. It can also lead to how to care for land. So some of those proverbs that we use, I will share with us today. And one of the most important ones that I stress for the most whenever we do our programs in our farm sites, whenever I'm just talking with friends, is kawama mua, kawama hope. And that proverb tells you that the answers for our future are found in the past. So obviously we learn history in school, and that kind of explains to you, like, you learning the mistakes of the past, but really I think we need to look more at the successes of the past and figure out how to bring those back to the table. And obviously the failures of the past we might not want to bring into our perspective. So this here is what our town looks like today, at least our farming lands. As you can see, it's really dry, fire-prone area. This is a site of my farm, and it's looking up at our mountain ranges. Traditionally, we are taught that, common knowledge today as a farmer, your responsibilities to your existence or to your farm limits yourself to the property lines and boundaries of your property. But traditionally for us, we're taught that as a farmer, we are called a mahi'ai. And as a mahi'ai, your responsibilities expand much beyond any of that. And you find yourself with responsibilities from the mountains to the ocean. And when you understand where your place is in those responsibilities, you get to understand one of the most important parts for any existence of life is what we call today a watershed. So the watershed starts off, not only, most people will identify watersheds by the mountains, but a large piece of our watershed is our ag lands and the way that we use them and treat them. So for us, we need to understand our mountain ranges. In Hawaii, we commonly name our land features, our geological features, based upon the sources or life-bearing qualities that they have. And then that will tell you as a human in the area, in the environment, what can be done in the area. And that's important for us to try and understand and get a hold of as a farmer. You want to know as much as you can of your area and what it can produce naturally without our influence or our facilitation in the area, if you will. That's really what our responsibilities are as people of the world, as people of the earth. Our responsibility is to facilitate the relationships of every living thing in the environment, in the ecosystem, in the universe. That's all we really can do. The day that we began to start to forget about that is, I think, where we all went wrong. So this is a farm site, and up there you can see the mountain ranges. If you look back at this very edge ridge line in the back. It kind of looks like a lady's face laying down. A lot of people in Lahaina reference her as the Lady of the Mountain. They don't know the historical qualities, but believe it or not, yes, it is a Lady of the Mountain. The creation story of that mountain comes to a name of Pu'uvaio Hina, which would translate to the heart of Hina. And the heart of Hina, Hina was a bearing, most of you probably would relate to her as Mother Earth. She buried all life, didn't really produce the earth. The earth was present, so we have a different Mother Earth, but she produced all living creatures and beings. And so to be her heart, her location of her heart, to us speaks volumes as far as what produces. And this valley that we're staring at produces the most amount of water in this watershed, if you will, in this hydrological unit of these mountain ranges. This valley produces the most amount of water on our end of the island. So I stress to teach the kids this, and as well as anyone else that's interested in farming, to understand your mountain range and your watershed and your role within it. And then you'll realize soon that it doesn't end or just begin in your farm site, and it doesn't end there either. This is another view we have of our farm site to just kind of give you guys an idea. You don't see any of the farm yet. It's just I'm literally took these photos just the other day. So I'm at the edge of my farm facing down at the ocean, and in the other photo I was in the center facing the mountain. That large smokestack there is what you see is what we our town has kept around to use as a monument or marker of the plantation era. The plantation has stopped here in Lahaina, and it was a mass production of sugarcane. So that was where the mill was located, and it processed all the sugar. And I grew up while it was still active. We literally had to drive right through the mill. One of our main roads drove through the smack dab center of the mill, and we would go to school. Today, that mill is broken down and disappeared, and all that's left is that large smokestack. Another proverb that we like to use on our farm site, as well as I try to keep it very strong in my home, is He ali'i ka aina, he kawa ke kanaka. The chief is the land, and its servants are the people. So that proverb speaks volumes to us as far as our practices go. We need to maintain that perspective and understand that the main producing and providing entity of the entire existence is the land. No one else should have that authority or right to say that we are the ultimate provider, if you will. We need to maintain that concept and that perspective that the land is the only thing that will provide for us, and that we need to make sure that that will continue to happen. This is a flower blossom, a native plant flower blossom that's slowly being depleted, or actually kind of rapidly. It's actually disappearing pretty quick with a new fungus that has showed up in Hawaii. And this is just a tree in my yard that my wife took a picture of, and I like to use it in this presentation. So on our farm site, this is our location when we just got started. 5 years now we've been here. I've been in the agricultural industry for quite some time. I've started out when I was just in high school. I was working in the plantations, Maui land and pine. So for the most majority of Hawaii, it's either sugarcane or pineapple when agriculture was king, or they say sugar was king, but we either was doing sugar or pineapples. And I was a young child in high school, just working. I was picking pineapples every year for 3 years. And then I moved to the Hawaii island, and I started working on a citrus farm there. So I've been in the agricultural industry, more so in that commercial state for a few years, about 5 years, and then I got out of there and I started, after graduating, I did some landscaping business, and then I went into farming again. I grew up with, my father was working for the golf course, but he also maintained a good system at home that we got to see and benefit from, where he left his practices of, using those heavy chemical pesticides and herbicides and fungicides and all those bad things he left there at work, but he came home and gave us a nice garden, and we raised rabbits. So I was kind of brought up that way, and I like to try and keep that. I wanted to bring that back into my family as I started to build a family. So we started doing farming and chickens and eggs and rabbits and fruits, and it kind of just kept going from there, and it got bigger and bigger, and now I'm operating on a 12.5 acre site, and we never introduced not one fertilizer, organic or non-organic, no pesticides, no sides at all, period. We just do a heavy mulching practice and a lot of composting. As you can see in this picture, we're building a mound system. We utilize wood chips on the left, and we get wood chips sourced out from our tree trimming services around our neighborhoods and our community. And then we also, on our right, you'll see these piles and mounds, and these are coffee parchments from another coffee farm a little ways down the road. And they are happy enough to give us all of their waste products. So this is just the outside corms and huskings of the coffee bean. These two ingredients mixed with some of our natural soils, and we also compost a lot of different animal waste inside of these. So being raised in Lahaina, I have a good connection into our community, and I know a lot of different people. We are a small town compared to most of where you folks come from, I would imagine. And so we go out to the fish markets, and we go out to some of our ranchers and even our hunters, and we once they knew what we're doing and what we're trying to establish, they are happy to bring their waste to our farm site, and then we just go and bury them into our piles and have them break down and compost, and we'll sit those in there. So we're gaining a lot of nutrient benefits in there. If you look at the photos that I shared of our surrounding environment, you can see that there's not much to offer. No trees, everything's been removed for the plantation era and for the growth of sugarcane. So I would like to ask everyone if you have any idea, or what is your idea of soil health? And when you think of soil health, what does it look like to you? What does soil health look like? For us, I'll use that proverb of the chief being the land. So a healthy chief reflects a healthy village. So wanting the best for our soils, we gave it the best we could. So we began with cutting the wild grasses, mixing in large mulch piles of 1 part wood chipping, 1 part coffee parchment, 1 part natural soils, and pretty much whatever animal carcasses we could get a hold of. So those are some of the animals that you may find in our piles. We don't stop there. We use their bones and their hoofs and all of that. We will burn those in a fire after they break down in the mulch piles. We sift through them and get out the bones, and we'll burn those down. And that's building some of the calciums that we'll need in our soils. Most of the farming communities that I've spoken to across the world, they have natural stones that produce calcium, or other elements or minerals and natural things that produce calcium for them in their soils. Hawaii, we don't have anything that produces calcium, except for some plants like kalo or taro that we grow, has a high concentrated density of calcium. So we utilize those things, and we make the best of those, as well as bone meals and different resources that we can get a hold of in our town. So this is a site. This is a picture of one of our sites. We practice As you can see, it's pretty barren and empty. This was the very beginning of our project. And we have heavy mulching laid down. We planted out just some coconut trees, as you can see, and we have all these big logs in places. People commonly reference us as agroforestry, polyforestry, organic or natural, regenerative ag practices, hugoculture. I've had all these different people come to our site and try and explain to me what it is that I'm doing scientifically. And I just like to keep it simple and say that I'm doing kamalu'ulu'olele. That way they can't really speak to the subject and tell me how to do what I need to do. But as you can see, we have this system developed where we've built up these bed systems and we've laid out our mulching, and we go at least about 8 inches thick, and we just bring water into our fields and we start that practice. There's a lot that I'd like to share and I won't due to the time restrictions, but we'll be open for questions and I can explain more details of how we produce what we do. And I'm just going to start going through some of our other photos to show you how we started and where we are now. This is kind of an idea of what it looks like as we got started. The picture on the left is just a shot of our dirt, of our soils and what it looks like. You can really see that there's not any organic matter there. When I first got on site, I started to turn over some large stones just to see what was living under the stones. And you wouldn't find much, maybe a scorpion here or there, and maybe a spider. Not any millipedes, no worms, no what people call them roly-polies, no microtillers, if you will. None of those beneficial insects were present. So I just kind of got a good feel for the land right off the back and started to understand that the center photo will show you literally our farm, one of our farm rows to the right, and then straight off to the left. We're just clearing a field out now and we're going to start planting that one out. But it kind of shows you like we don't have anything to start with. It's really barren, fallow lands that have no nutrients and very little rainfall. The picture on the right is what this picture in the center looked like just before we cut it all down and cleared it up. We tend to cut the wild grasses down at least 3 times before we start to farm into them. And we'll mulch over all of that leaf litter there present. So that's just kind of a breakdown of what it looks like when we get started. These are some of the benefits that we see as we get involved and we start to move in. We've been doing a lot of observations. We call it kilo aina, or land observations when we're on site. So these are actually 5 different shots. They don't break down very well, but this top left-hand corner is the result of our mulching as it breaks down. And if you're familiar with fungi or funguses, they're a really good indicator that you're developing a good microhaze and rhizosphere, if you will. It shows that life is beginning to take place and organic matter is present. So mycelium is one of those foundation funguses, and this top left-hand photo is our mulching mediums littered with that mycelium context. So that's a real big benefit. And then if you look at that bottom left, it's some different mushrooms in there that you can see clusters of. And those are what we noticed that started popping up when we started to introduce nitrogen-rich mulching. And then this center photo has some beige mushrooms with some of our perennial peanut nitrogen-fixing plants in it. That kind of shows you, this is where we introduced concentrated calcium harvest from our farm. So we harvest a bunch of our taro and we ferment that in just a big bin of water. We have a gravity-fed system of stream water, and that kind of gives you a calcium buildup. And that's what we introduce, and these mushrooms show up right after that. So these funguses are indicators for us of what is within our soils. So we know that the mycelium is a foundation that's building up different nutrient concentrations and densities. And then as they start to break down and develop different mushrooms and funguses that show up, it lets us know that different concentrations are present in the area. So that helps us to know what we can plant in the area without having to necessarily introduce fertilizers, if you will. That's a real big benefit to understand. You got to know what can grow in your area naturally if you want to be the best of an impact to the area. Don't try to bring stuff in that don't fit the natural environment, because we're just trying to be that person that can produce everything when really the land is what's going to allow you to produce what you can. And then you can see some other mushrooms there that are present on the right-hand side, and a fungus here on one of our logs that we have on our field. But these are all different mushrooms that show up, and they indicate for us different levels of nutrients in our soils. We also introduced some of our traditional plants. Our native crops is what we pride ourselves on. On the left here is a picture of a nitrogen fixing crop, and those are all of the little nodes in the root system that hold a high nitrogen concentration. So nitrogen is what you need to keep your plants nice and green and full of leaves, so that they can generate a lot of photosynthesis, so they can get their energy from the sun. It's very important to have a nitrogen level, and it's probably out of the three main nutrients that you need for agriculture, it's probably it's the one that you will need consistently throughout the plant's production, if you will, or life. And the center is a picture of a kalo, and we just appreciate this image because it's catching the very little rainfall that we get. So that water droplet or puddle or catchment that you can see in the leaf is just from some rainfall that we've got, and figure we include that because it kind of shows a good canopy. It shows that the plants will collect water for themselves. As that fills to a certain weight, the leaf tips over, and believe it or not, it runs it down the stem that has a natural channel that it grows and diverts water straight to the source of the plant. It's something that we can all learn from. And then the picture on the right is a candle nut tree or a kukui nut tree. Traditionally, these trees were found very consistently in the traditional agricultural field systems of Hawaii. Its leaf litter is thin, so it breaks down quick, produces nitrogen, drops a lot of leaves, and then it also has the candle nuts that are produced off of the tree. The husking of those produce phosphorus for our soils. So those are the nutrients that you need that are beneficial. There's a few trees that are commonly found in our traditional ag systems, but we are introducing these back to our fields. These photos are little older. These trees now are about 20 feet tall. This tree in this picture is only about 6 feet tall. So here's some of our results of farming the way that we've been farming. The photo to our left is me and one of my co-workers. There's just 3 of us on site at all times. These are kalo plants or taro plants that we grew on our site, and we've established our record as far as the yield goes. One of the corm in my left hand is almost 11 pounds in weight. So that feeds a lot of people with just that 11 pounds. The way we process those corms of kalo will you can run it through a wheat grinder. Traditionally, we make it with a stone and a wooden board, much like a mortar and pestle, if you will. And we pound it into a paste, much like mochi, if you guys are familiar with that, with Chinese. And then we add a lot of water to it, and it'll just stretch it out and almost doubles your yield when you add water to it. And then you can feed a 10-pound kalo will feed about 20 people in one meal. So it goes pretty far. In the center is a photo of my lovely wife. She's behind that harvest of some of our native teas. This tea plant took off for us really well in the area. It was growing naturally. It would show up as a volunteer on the farm, and we just tended to it and gave it some of our attention, and it took off really well. It does not look like this in its natural environment. It's very twiggy and very little leaf, but this plant aids you in your upper respiratory systems. So when the COVID or pandemic came upon the world, we began distributing this medicinal crop of ours, our traditional native medicinal crop, throughout our community, and just giving it out as a potential ailment to our systems and to our community. And then on the right, you can see a papaya tree that we have there. It's pretty healthy and yielding a good amount of some papayas. And when we exist with all of that good nutrients and benefits, we start to find other things start to show up on site that weren't commonly found. These are 3 different images of native species. So this actually on the left is a crossbreed of a native owl and a barn owl. But the owls won't be present unless there's food. So when there's food on your site, the mice show up. When the mice show up, the predators show up. So for us, it's a good indicator. You know, a lot of people panic and get worried when they have mice and rodents in their farm sites, but it's something that we have to understand, that it's a part of the existence in our Kumulipo, or our story for Hawaii of the development of the world or creation of the world. Even the rat and the mouse is identified in that story. So for us, anything that's identified in the creation of the world tells us that it has a very important role in there. Then the center picture is a native bird that is known as a scavenger, but can find food out from other animals and crops almost anywhere. So it started to frequent our farm, and then we have a native bee that's pollinating one of our crops in this right-hand image as well. So I am getting the notice that we are running out of time, so I'm just gonna pick it up a little bit. So this is one of our taro plants here on the bottom in the left hand with my hand, just to give you a size reference of the harvest that's coming up. This was just taken a few days ago. And this is another image here on the right of those kalo that we held up, and it gives you kind of some size references. That's a gallon water bottle there on the ground. And it's just laying next to some of these kalos. These are fairly large kalos for today's production in the agriculture of taro and kalo. There's not much people that are growing regeneratively or organically, or however you want to identify that is fine with me, but not too many people are growing that way. And most of them that are not having the success of yielding kalo at this size. So it's a big indicator for us that we're onto something. You remember that picture I showed earlier of what our dirts look like, what our dirt and soil look like when we first arrive and we start to work on? And this picture on the left is what our dirt looks like today. And then that picture on the right is a photo I just took the other day as well of our farm site. In this photo, you can see some of our turmeric, or our native turmerics called olena. You can see some of our sweet potato vine patching out, and then you can see some of our lemongrass and some sugarcane, native sugar canes, and some of our other crops that are utilized not only for food production, but multiple different uses. And I think that kind of wraps me up right now. So that brings me, I've just got the timer, so we're out of time. And this is just a picture that I wrap up. And one last proverb I'd like to leave you all with. This is a picture of my son in one of our taro patches or kalo patches at our farm site. And the proverb that I think is important for us all to understand is "A'ole hana nui I ke alu ia." No task is too big when done together. I thank you all for the opportunity to present. I look forward to any other opportunity, maybe a little more time allotted, but I'm open for any questions, and I appreciate all of you present, and thank you all for the opportunity to share what we're doing and how we're doing it over here on our little corner of the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaipo. So inspiring. And the transition is just incredible to see. And the connection to the earth is what is obviously so absent. You mentioned that this land was plantation land, and I guess they were growing pineapples and sugarcane. And obviously what they did to the land is in many ways criminal, right? I mean, because there was no respect shown for the value of the ecosystem and what it meant to the people of Hawaii, right? So our thinking and your inspiration, I think, is what needs to drive the future of how we approach land management. And the project that Autumn is spearheading in Hawaii for us in terms of non-agricultural land, I think could benefit from your orientation as well. That is, soil being the chief and people being the servants of that soil, which I think is really important for us to take away from your presentation. So again, thank you so much. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of our screen here. We're getting a lot of just really positive feedback about the presentations, both in terms of the breadth and depth, and you know, the inspiration that they provide and the motivation to take action. I'll just read a few. This is to you, Kaipo. Thank you so much. Then there's a question in there. Kaipo, are there indigenous methods for determining specific soil deficiency you could share? It was clear that the land was depleted, but how did you know it specifically needed calcium, for example?
Okay, so for us understanding our soils period of Hawaii, we're volcanic soils. So there is no natural calcium generated in our soil. So right off the back, anywhere you farm in Hawaii, unless someone was just farming right before you, there will be no calcium available in our soils. It doesn't occur naturally. So we know right off the back, if you go into one of those old fields where I went, there was no one farming there for over 11 years. And the one that was farming before me was the sugar plantations. And the calcium wasn't a huge need for sugar, so they weren't adding too much of that out there. And then at the same time, if they were, it was a synthetic form. So it was something that we didn't want to sit on. Of course, we've also done our soil samples. We've turned our soils into the labs and had those soil samples done just to confirm our understanding. To be completely honest, I barely know how to read any of those things that come off of those science guys with all those big charts and show us all of those different nutrients and minerals and all that stuff in the soils. But for me, learning a lot through research and history, there's articles that I dug up in our old newspapers. We had a newspaper print right here in our town. And fortunate enough, I was looking at genealogy and research of my family lineage, and I found an article of my great-grandfather in an old village that we lived in. And they were trying to be taught how to farm radishes and lettuce. And this foreign guy came into the village and wanted to teach the kids how to grow these vegetables. It was a great thing, awesome. But unfortunately, he wasn't familiar with the soil health and the makeup of our soil. So he was struggling himself to have grow what he wanted to have grow in the area. And in result, the students, my grandfather in this article was 12 years old. My great-grandfather was 12 years old in the article, and they began to bring their practices to the class and was showing the teacher what they used to generate the nutrients they needed to grow their crop. And in result, his crops began to flourish as well. So in the end, the kids of that village taught that farmer who came to the village how to farm their practices. And in there, they described the natural ingredients, if you will, to the recipe and how they utilize those to grow what they did. So that's kind of how, that's where we took off. That's where we started to use our limpets from the ocean as we harvest and eat those. We don't waste, we take the shells, and how I did this as a kid growing up. I had no idea what I was doing, but I did it as a kid because I was told to do it. We had to heat water by fire. I was in this old village that I speak of that my family came from, and we would throw all the shells under that into the fire of this water heater, and as they would cook down, we would then have to shovel all of that out from the fire pit, and we would go and introduce it into the water stream systems that fed into our fields of farming. So much like rice paddies with water, our taro fields have the same thing. So what they were doing is these shells were now brittle from the fire and breaking down as they tumbled their way into the water, and they were releasing calcium into those fields of farming. And it was a slow release process, basically, with just putting food that you ate, its waste was then going into the system and giving back into the field. And they recorded that in these newspaper articles. So that's kind of where it started off for me. And it also explained how they use, so I mentioned that our kalo, if you look at the nutritional scale, has 10 times the amount of milk. So if you had a quorum of kalo that was a pound, you would have 3 gallons of milk to equal the amount of calcium that was found in there. That's dairy milk, cow's milk. We can argue different when it turns to almonds and all that kind of stuff, of course, but kalo is a very high calcium plant. And when we process that kalo, that taro, we take the skin off, and that process there was not wasted either. That skins were now put back into our fields as well in different forms in the past. Today, we kind of speed it up by putting it in water and fermenting it and then introducing it into the fields. It also gives it a concentration so that we can dilute it and spread it further. So that kalo is a calcium fix, and that's kind of what we indicated. That image of those fungus that I showed with that nitrogen plant, it was center of the screen of funguses. When we started to introduce that kalo water, if you will, those mushrooms started to grow everywhere where we put it. So that was an indicator that those mushrooms are consuming calcium, and that's why they're present and growing. And so that's kind of how we started off from there. And like we knew now, okay, let's try and plant something there that demands a high calcium fix. And in doing so, we receive bountiful yields. So for us, it was an indicator that, okay, we've now introduced calcium, and prior to that, the plants that we were planting that had that same demand for calcium were not producing the yield that we needed. So that was kind of the indicators that we used and how we came about to use them. Sorry, it was a long answer.
No, that's great. I also want to emphasize what you said somewhat in passing, but is central to what you're describing, I think, and I think we should all hear this clearly, is that you are generating the resources the farm needs from the farm and from the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's where you're breaking the chain of dependency to the petrochemicals or to the outside inputs. Can you speak a little bit more about how you're experimenting, and do you get any support from Extension or others in the community that see the value of, especially on an island, but this is true throughout farming communities, that we've bypassed the soil with our fertility? In your case, you've taken another step. Not only you're not bypassing the soil, but you're generating the nutrients and the supplements that are needed for your soil on site.
Yeah, well, for me, the simple answer to that is I live on a very low budget. So even if I wanted to, I can't afford to buy the fertilizers that I would need, whether they were chemical fertilizers or organic fertilizers. I've been in a stage once for a few years where I was trying to farm out a little further at another end of the island. I was purchasing organic fertilizers, and I couldn't survive there because of the cost of just the lease alone, the water costs, and then buying those fertilizers wasn't doable for me, and the yield, the production that we were pulling off. Even though we were selling out at our farmers markets and I had restaurant chefs in line for our products, our produce, I still couldn't keep up with the cost of farming. It's pretty expensive here in Hawaii. But yeah, supporting the community, we're definitely getting good traction. In the beginning, it was really slow, and that's fine. I always told myself getting into the project that our work would speak for itself and that people will find value in it when we produce what we do, what we can. And as we're starting to increase our production and we're doing plant outs with kids, we're sending plants home with different participants. We're meeting them on that as well. We're going into our community and coming into our neighborhoods and helping people start their projects, start a little garden in their yard. These are all indicators that we use. One of those, it comes down to our proverbs again. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but these are really my foundations of who I am. And this one translates, I'll just keep it simple, and it translates to all rising tide lifts all boats. Some of you might know that translation. For us, we also use it as the crabs in the bucket syndrome. It's a reverse on that kind of thing. So you get a bunch of crabs in the bucket, they're all trying to get out, but as soon as one gets close to the top, the other one pulls it back down. So we want to use that and say, like, don't be that crab that pulls the other crab down. Be the crab that lifts him up. And then the person that gets lifted up and taken out of that bucket, be that crab that turns around and helps the rest of them out. You know, set a lineup and bring everybody out. So that's that high tide and lifting all boats. You're not just going to lift yourself and get out of town. So we do that in our community before we do any systems or any projects or any teachings or outreaches. We sit down as our team. Like I said, it's my wife and another lady, Jade Chihara. She works with us on the farm there. We make sure that foremost, we want to contribute to the people that are present and participating before we can consider how do we benefit out of anything that we do. That's been really successful for us to gain support to our community. And we're definitely, we're getting people that are coming across us in one program and one conversation, and they're now asking us across. We meet them in another circle at another thing, whether it's a community event or a football game for our kids. They're like, hey, I remember I learned this thing from you, or I seen you do this, and now I'm trying to do that at home, and I can't really remember how you did it. And I'm like, oh, what did you do so far? And they lay out what they did, and I'm like, oh, you're pretty much there. You just forgot this part. And to me, that's big indicators that people are trying to make that transition. You know, we consume a lot of fish being on an island. We consume a lot of things out of the ocean. So I'm introducing that into our community. Do not waste of the fish. We don't eat the guts and the intestines of the fish. So, but let's not waste it. So we're making that into fertilizers as well. And we're teaching our community how to do those things.
Fantastic. So let me jump over to Dr. Miller, and then I'll come back. And I know there are more questions for you, Kaipo. Dr. Miller, there's a question here regarding the sensitivity associated with chemical exposure and whether tilt is a contributor to long-haul COVID syndrome, or if you have any theories or any insight into that. We always say when we look at issues around health that we create vulnerabilities which increase the harm associated with ongoing exposure to other events. So do you have any thoughts on that relationship?
I do. It's a great question. So these same parts of our cells, the mast cells, they're the guardians against all xenobiotics, all foreign things, which includes obviously chemicals, pesticides, but also intracellular organisms, which means all viruses like COVID, rickettsia, for example, Lyme disease, the one that causes Lyme disease. And so many of the patients that we work with who've become ill after an exposure event go on to get diagnoses where they've shown some of these things in their systems, but it all started with that original exposure event. And our sense of it, we're actually working with a clinic here in San Antonio which sees long haul patients, and they're using the Queasy now in those patients, a whole cohort of those patients, and finding that many of them indeed have chemical, food, and drug intolerances. And then we launched a second national survey, which asks about the experience of people who were chemically intolerant by the Queasy again, what their experience has been with COVID, with vaccinations, and so on. So we're getting that data back. But what I'm hearing, these are all things that if they were chemically intolerant previously, they really don't do as well with whatever, or if it's Lyme disease or if it's COVID or another virus. They get very sick, and many of them, it's a tough one because many of them are afraid to get a vaccination because they have adverse reactions sometimes to vaccines. And as a physician, I'm stuck in this position of, well, it's a terrible condition to have. So the vaccines can be really important in terms of saving lives. And so it really comes down to the patient making that own evaluation by themselves, whether they want to risk it. Many of them, are so isolated because they're so sensitive that they don't see other people anyway. So they're feeling like, well, we're going through the same, other people are now having to avoid social engagements and being around others, just like we've been doing for decades, right? So the question that we're wondering about is, we actually are seeing, it appears to be an increase in sensitivity, so in the Queasy scores, maybe by 50% among the groups population-based survey we did with US adults, 50% increase since the first survey, which was done pre-COVID. So from before COVID till after COVID, it looks like there may be a 50% increase. Now, is that because the viruses are being activated, are activating the mast cells too, or does it have to do with the fact that we were told, right, you need to disinfect everything, use disinfectants on your hands, at work, use disinfectants, at home. I know people, this is sad, but they were spraying their ceilings with disinfectants. Well, that's kind of outlandish, but there weren't good instructions, there was not good knowledge on the part of the federal government in terms of what practices people would adopt. I think the biggest problem in my mind is that many people who didn't realize they were chemically intolerant, now they started using, bleach on all their counters, and that's a big surface area, on floors. If anyone was working in a hospital, they would come home and they were afraid of spreading it to their neighbors. And part of that spreading is related to many very poor families, and we have a large proportion of very poor families in San Antonio who live in small dwellings, and it's hard to avoid others in the family, and so the virus was spreading among the family members. But then they start using disinfectants and bleach, and everybody's exposed to that. And actually, this is weird, the fragrance sales during that period of time zoomed. I mean, totally went off the wall. And that was being advertised, if you watch the commercials, by people who made disinfectants, and they were making disinfectants with fragrances in them to appeal to certain groups, for example, to Hispanics or to African Americans. They found fragrances that were often liked by those individuals. Again, these are all synthetic organic chemicals. So the question is, did people get worse from COVID and become more susceptible to the virus and other intracellular organisms?
The other interesting connection, you talked about sick building and issues around ventilation. And I don't know if have you noticed that there is more awareness about the need for ventilation, air exchange in buildings, especially because of the ambient transmission of viruses now? Does that help greater understanding?
Well, it's helped the understanding among people who are, listening to that information. more often, people can't increase the ventilation, especially in their own homes. And in commercial buildings, how, that kind of situation, it's not easy to increase the amount of fresh air coming in. I mean, you've got windows all around, you're less likely to get sick. And we know that in the schools too, if they can open windows. But most places now are sealed buildings. Anything built in recent times. And so, you're going to get exposures to a lot of things. And of course, we hear from many, many teachers who were concerned about COVID, but who've gotten sick from things they use in the classroom, art supplies they use in the classroom, pesticides that have been sprayed to protect everybody against things. So, and
then another question, and then we need to get back to Kaipo. There are a lot of questions for you. This issue of people speaking to the medical community in their communities. In many communities, the medical community engages and understands and gets very active in talking to elected officials and practitioners about the hazards associated with pesticides and what steps could be taken to help prevent exposure and transition away from chemical use. You've, in your career, have experienced a lot of pushback from the medical community. Do you see that changing? And do you have any advice for people who are trying to engage the medical community in their community to discuss these issues?
Right. And so just like you and what you're doing, reaching to the community level is critical, because that's where the doctors and patients live. They're not watching the national public health media. Yes, there is certainly the doctors, and particularly all doctors have maybe 15 to 20 minutes with a patient at best. And so if you're sick, you have to find a way of presenting yourself and your information rapidly in a way that doctors can receive it. They see the publications, which is why we have all this information available to you. And then they can put that information into their, either into a website, which we have a university-wide website, and that's what's being done. So those questionnaires I showed you are available to our researcher and our physicians. But then if you're a patient out in a community, a small community, then you can take the breezy queasy and that exposure history, do it online, either send it or print it out and take it to your doctor and ask that it be put in your medical record. The most useful thing is if you or someone can help you do that symptom star and show how you were, before I was exposed to, the oil spill, or to spraying from pesticides in an adjacent field, and how you were before and how you were after that. That's very compelling evidence for physicians, for people that do insurance determinations, disability determinations. The biggest problem is that doctors don't know they haven't understood tilt. Now they have the tools, they can do it, but frankly, this has to be driven from the bottoms up, right? From people who are affected, going to their doctors, taking the information, saving the time, but you can have a discussion and then it goes in your medical record. And we would like EPA and other places, NIH, that look at things like the Gulf oil spill to start using this tool. And we've advocated that. I think, that will happen. And if it's in the medical records for patients who are throughout a small community, that will inform them. But the real answer here is, we've got to get to the regulators and to the physicians. Physicians convince the regulators.
Yeah, I think having this tool and bringing personal stories and encouraging medical practitioners to become advocates in that way, to say, look, I have patients who are exposed to these chemicals and I support transitioning away from their use in our parks and our schools or wherever. So thank you for that. I need to switch gears here for a moment to Kaipo. There have been a number of questions about drift, and we know that on Hawaii, there are a number of experimental sites, chemical companies experimenting with pesticides, with genetically engineered organisms. So here's a question: are any Bayer test plots near your farm? And is there a risk from drift? And this person's from the Midwest. Drift is a tremendous problem in the Midwest, US. How do you deal with that if you have that problem? Or
Yeah, fortunately enough for me, I'm not near any of those fields. The nearest experimental field from me is roughly about 47 miles away.
oh wow.
And it's more in Autumn's area of residency. She lives more towards the south end of our island, and I live clear over on the west end. So we're separated by a mountain range that reaches about 6,000 foot elevation. So I'm pretty clear on my end. And then another benefit I have is there's a chocolate farmer right next to me. Aside that, we'll leave that alone. But we there's no one else really farming right around me. I'm in the middle of an old cane field. Nobody really wants to be there. It's not a desirable spot. There's no trees for shade or anything. We need to create that ourselves. So I'm pretty lucky in that area.
Yeah. Everybody, the compliments coming in are tremendous. What wonderful talks. Thank you. Are there indigenous methods for determining specific soil deficiencies? It was clear that the land was depleted. I guess you've sort of answered that question previously.
Yeah, there's one here that I was also typing to answer some of those questions while we were going through. But one of them I didn't get to reach, and I'm a really slow typer. I don't do much of these computer things. But this person asked, writing from the lands of suburbia, where approximately 12 landscaping trucks and constant excruciating noise of weed whackers and lawnmowers have been nonstop. So I get that. I used to do some landscaping. That said, how do we bring the lessons and wisdom? Okay. To me, two things that landscapers look for to solve all of their problems right away, right? One of them is nutrients deficiencies, and the other one are weeding. So I grew up as a punishment. I would have to pull weeds when I was a not good kid. So I was sent out into the yard or into the field, and I'd have a bucket, and I'd have to fill that bucket up with weeds in order to get free. So I do not like pulling weeds. I've come to realize that most weeds are not what we think they are. Like I said in the creation chant, everything has a purpose and a place. So it can get very difficult to speak to landscapers and neighbors on these subjects, but you have to find those remedies. So there's a lot of plants that can be ornamental and beneficial to your soils. They produce nutrients. A lot of those plants are viewed as weeds. Now, if you can get it across to the landscaper that those aren't weeds and that they can be quite attractive and ornamental and also benefit you, so you won't be buying your nitrogen fertilizers anymore because this guy will take care of that problem for you. Now, those are the discussions I have with landscapers today. Like, hey, don't send them out there into the lawn to pull those weeds, because those are actually keeping your lawn nice and green without you having to buy any synthetic fertilizers that cost a lot. And mulching, heavily mulching in beds. If they want their grass lawn, they're not going to want to mulch that thing. But if you have like bedding systems of flowers and all that kind of stuff, the heavy mulching will eliminate those weeds, so they'll stop spraying the herbicides that they feel they need to use. I do heavy. That was the beginning foundation to my whole farming practice, was to mulch out the weeds that we didn't want, because I knew that if I sent my kids out there, I have 4 kids, if I send them out there to do what I had to do, I would have a good chance of them not wanting to be where I want them to be, which is in the field. So if I could get rid of those problems for them, that would make it that much more likely that I would have that success. So for me, that's where it started, is trying to make sure that my kids would appreciate the work that we're doing and even enjoy it. So that's where I started to find, okay, this weed is a good weed. We don't need to pull that guy out. This weed isn't necessarily helping us, but it can benefit us with leaf litter. So let's cut it down a few times and then we'll mulch over it. And that's just kind of where it goes.
And part of this, as Autumn said in the beginning, is culture, you know, changing our relationship with the land, our understanding of plants, nutrient cycling, native vegetation. You know, these are all things we have to relearn in our communities. So I promised at the beginning of this that I would extend the session by 30 minutes for questions, and we've now reached the end of that. So, boy, I want to thank our speakers. You guys exceeded all expectations, and I'm glad we have this tape. We will be sharing this widely, very widely. If there are any follow-up documentations that you think should be made available. It looks like you got an offer to write a children's book, Kaipo, on the questions there. So, you know, we expect there to be great things following up on this, and we certainly will continue these conversations and believe this is a springboard for incredible, important work. You're both doing incredible work. Our job as a national and international organization is to leverage this work so that more people are hearing this, more people are using this information, and we can meet these existential threats that we are all experiencing and reading about on a daily basis. So, peace. We appreciate everything you're doing, and we will be in touch with everybody soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.